has been enacted since 1970, 2018, 28 of 28 member states to increase the majority of eligible voters in 15 states to not exist the right to vote, turn and balance to turn wealthier citizens, weakening legitimacy countries that apply elections that equality voter turn increases the voter turnout. Declines for second order elections, European elections, expects the strongest social distortion in many elections. Thus, the plan in the European Union voting in the European Parliament and parliamentary elections ought to be compulsory. The plan is key to reinvigorating EU legitimacy. It increases turnout, strengthens Parliament, and unifies the EU in the face of rising far-right populism. Independently, it spills over to broader civic engagement and awareness. This evidence includes punishment. Marco Polo 09. Mandatory voting is appropriate for the European parliamentary election. Voting compulsory to boost turnout, allow the parliament to claim data legitimacy missing from the other EU countries. And second, recreation the EU electorate unified and increasing awareness in the European issues as well. The cost of civic education. And third, harmonious political landscape. Eagerness to vote higher and extreme weeks of the political structure. Today's fashion far right Eurosceptic parties are across the turn. That's just the majority of the system would have been as the extreme right wing party European parliament judges with a higher degree of representation to avoid a central political view. So the turnout damages the image of the union abroad. Civic education costs would require large investments over a longer period of time, with certain results. Introducing mandatory voting in the EU would punish substantial small funds which go to the EU budget in countries that practice citizens have higher interest in politics and requirements of its rebuilding. Civic duty fulfills universal political rights and builds the democratic ideals of participation and equality and strong EU legitimacy and soft power in the face of populism. Sustains liberal multilateralism in the world order that solves climate, econ crisis, and arms control. That's Durbis 19. Europe's soft power to cooperate with hackers and promote a robust global order and trade and help digital issues, attack control by SDGs in the European Union should amplify policies to multilateral institutions. Europe benefits from soft power and giving free political power will weaken Europe. Must lead by examples and projects as values everywhere. They hope the European Union, the champion of the United States, realistic should be kept alive. China forces seeking greater freedom, multilateral or bent to emerge and working toward a peaceful multilateral world order can make the EU a very new type of different superpower. And the liberal world order prevents extinction from nuclear war and climate change. Ferrari 18. Attempt to divide the world result in war and genocide, common goals can only be solved through global cooperation, nuclear war, climate change, and technology, arms racing guarantees whoever wins lose will be humanity to consider autonomous weapons system. The only thing that can prevent arms racing is greater trust that it's not possible and survive humankind needs global cooperation, not available. The only viable blueprint is liberalism, and warming guarantees extinction. There are multiple scenarios. That's Spectre 19. Climate change poses an existential threat and temperature increase of 5.4 degrees. Ice sheet vanish, rocks field the Amazon rainforest. 35% of the population is subject to lethal heat conditions. The human survivability. 1/3 of the land goes into desert ecosystem collapsing. The coral reefs and rainforest. The Arctic ice sheet destroying agriculture. Destroying agriculture. 21 billion refugees. Massive use of refugees. Couple pollution. Coastlines. Dropping food and water fat. Stress the nations are in the conflict of resource women in nuclear war. And EU is facing economic crisis now. Political unity, multilateralism. Checks Stevens, Griffith, and EU in 20. Projections of Euro's economy will shrink to 4%, except the deepest economic recession in history. 2009 revolutionary by 4.5%. The economic fallout could pressure the world economy for years. Upon European recession, renewed recovery was fell out in history. European companies bankrupted. People live the world across this region. Political divisions between the north and south, and prolonged economic crisis causes global nuclear war. Lou 18. Economic crisis escalated major global military conflict, treating a sector economic approach, structural reform policymakers who would have ugly failed unprecedented access to liquidity was not allocated in a most efficient way for a long period of economic distress characterized by industries that fuel and terrorism, even more high levels of inequalities through conflict. Economic crisis could lead to illusory military confrontation. Thus, that causes extinction, nuclear war, followed criticization, mass starvation, STAR 15. A war fought with nuclear weapons would be mass extinction of annexation. This is an event of utter finality for many years. Would be too cold and dark for food. Radioactive fallout could poison the rest of and tons of smoke would destroy the ozone layer. Block us on liquid acid to protect the virtually nuclear world. Leave the earth essentially uninhabitable. And melting permafrost provides ancient antibiotic-resistant diseases that we've lost immunity to, and it threatens global epidemics. Phosphorus 17. Melting permafrost releases ancient viruses and bacteria. Permafrost is a perfect place for bacteria to remain alive as long as a billion years. Because cold, no oxygen, dark skin, caused global epidemics in the past. Scientists discovered potentially the massacres in Alaska, bubonic plague in Siberia, and that currently frozen past 32,000 years old. Once it's melted, it begins swimming unaffected, and permafrost layers of lethal and mining and drilling operations could cause disasters, and viruses could emerge from the Neanderthals and bacteria resistant to 18 antibiotics, including drugs considered last reserve for 4 million years. They have not come in contact with people or antibiotic drugs, and antibiotic resistance has been around for billions of years, and those pandemics cause extinction. Millet 17. Disease has been responsible for the greatest death. Also, future pandemics result in human extinction, irreversible collapse of civilization to overlay their species going extinction. Disease also large human populations wiped out, especially in multiple diseases were introduced in some diseases at 100% case fatality rate. The other diseases spread to every human community and 95% of the population. Framework. The standard is maximizing expected well-being, pleasure, and pain are intrinsically valuable to necessities. Hedonism. Moment 16. There is something unendably good about pleasure, something unendably bad about pain. We never ask when the end is being pleased with pleasure is a choice within yourself. With pleasure and pain are both places where usually outlined in terms of value. Prefer additional one is A-spec, 8-point application. Every policy benefits some hard result. It will also mean second choice reaction. 8.2 commission distinction to human is an action of itself. Government side not actually needs to be presented with the efforts to choose between two actions, either which is an omission. C.No force a distinction would be perceived consequence because part of our deliberation, which is intrinsic to our actions since we tend to happen. And 2, the only consequential is mixed degrees of arguments. I think a promise to meet up for lunch that's not as bad as taking a promise to take a dying person in the hospital, and the consequences of breaking the promise explained. The second one is much worse than the first intuitions that way the foundational basis of any argument theories that contradict our intuitions mostly false. Even we can't deductively determine why the underview. One error theory won't have because otherwise then I can engage in debating possibly won't reject the debate or too short from theory and substantive implications or key to check if you see no review as they can say with 6 minutes of answers to a short argument make the two are impossible. 3 point convenient interpretations. 1 error interprets our bidirectional have to defend the north since they have more time. E point no do 2 in our theory, 2 to 1 time trade-off makes it devastating for the Tory. At point half theory comes first. It's a bigger percentage than 1 error than 1 is used more abuse offended, but a larger fraction of my time. And only 2 in time it has time to win multiple layers. This is also the reason why 1 error theory comes before T. And the EU Parliament has limited jurisdiction. The laundry list of other methods are historically worse. Only the plan solstice answers advantage counterplans and Mocha Polio 9. There's little room for reforming voting and simplifying the procedure for registering voting has little effect. Less than 1 to 2 voters elected for representatives would have to attack a communicated strategy. Most institutional remedies fall within the jurisdiction of the state. Turnout requirements also not very likely to succeed in single transferable voters. Notoriously long conflict, civic education, lower voting ages have doubt results. Younger groups or less voter turnout. E-voting would require considerably financial resources, conservative technology, security, whole internet penetration, digital literacy to increase inequality. EU states employ mail pride proxy, color credit proxy.
All right, ready?
Yeah.
Okay, liberal world order guarantees peace. This evidence talks about some like nuclear wars, climate change. What wars would what specific wars are you preventing from flaring up?
So we have sort of made arguments as to why countries across the world, specifically countries like China, the United States, sort of our laundry list of global great powers, operate in sort of an aggressive anarchic manner towards one another.
So who would China invade?
The argument is sort of less that like we point to a single war. Rather, we have made arguments that trends over the last few decades, and specifically during things like sort of licensing a little bit before that, we have isolated sort of geopolitical trends that increase aggression is sort of rising.
Can you
exactly what the break is or where that's going to be. Yeah, so we have made the argument that there are a finite number of resources in the world. We have isolated that climate change, sort of resource disputes, etc., mean that there's inevitably going to be a rising quantity of conflict between global great powers because there's a finite quantity of resources. Absent some sort of cohesive international body that can sort of broker peace and serve as a negotiating table for these sort of geopolitical states, we think the sort of conflict described in our impact evidence is inevitable.
Sure. Economic decline. I guess who goes to war? Same question.
We have made arguments as to why the European economy, or the economy of the European Union, is sort of a key focal point of trade for a lot of not just sort of neighboring countries, but countries that rely.
I guess like that makes sense in the context of the EU, but the global economy just tanked due to a pandemic. Your evidence does not take that into account. It's been like the biggest decline since like the Great Depression. How has that not triggered a war?
Well, firstly, our evidence does take this into decline. It's from May of 2020, but
you read a 2018 impact card.
Well, okay, our like uniqueness evidence about how economic crisis is happening now in EU and how a prolonged crisis leads to specific consequences is very recent. And the reason it's not thumped by COVID is because our evidence is like very specific regarding sort of the time length of sort of the time frame for this economic decline. We are not saying collapse causes war. This isn't like something that can be deducted, and it's not like a one-off impact. Rather, we make the argument that a prolonged period of recession is sufficient to trigger instability and war. We have also read evidence that
are currently in a prolonged period of recession, but that's fine. The pandemic stuff.
I think our evidence seems to indicate that we're sort of rising out of the recession, and things are sort of gradually getting better everywhere except the U.S. because U.S. politicians are kind of domeless. But like our evidence or uniqueness evidence indicates that like the EU economy is getting better right now. Could be sort of getting better, but the only way to ensure that happens is political unity and multilateralism.
I guess you read the 1AR theory stuff, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's fine. I'll take a little bit of prep. Okay, I have 322 left. I'll send it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Two off case. Case starting on the 1AR theory underview and then top down.
1 sec, I haven't gotten the doc yet.
I'm good.
Okay.
Sorry,
everyone
my
ready?
email is extremely slow. I
No, no problem.
haven't gotten it yet. With the file sharing glitch where like people leave the room, if like you put it in file share and I'm the only one who opens it, do I just get kicked out or does everyone get kicked out?
I have no idea.
Okay, because like okay, so I have like no idea what my email is doing, and if I can just like rejoin the room after I open it from file share.
I can try to file share it.
Thanks.
Yeah, it should be in.
Great.
All right, is everyone ready?
Yeah, I am good.
Cool. A is the interpret the F can't defend that a subset of democracy sought to make voting compulsory. The article A implies a non-specific or generic reading of the word democracy. Walden 20. A use with singular countable class with a non-specific or generic. But democracy is a generic indefinite singular. Leslie 12 indefinite singulars can be general existential tiger on the front line. We are saying something in general with the existential interpretations operate details with the sentence generic and not the test whether we can insert an ever drawn of conjugation with a minimal change. This applies to the resolution 1. Upward entailment test. In a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory doesn't apply that in a society voting ought to be compulsory because voting might not be compulsory in an authoritarian or communist regime. 2. Adverb test. In a democracy, voting usually ought to be compulsory. It doesn't substantially change the meaning of the resolution. B is the violation. Only defend the EU will insert a shard of other democracies into the doc. C. Vote neg. 1. Semantics that way. A. Topicality is a constitutive rule of the activity and a basic effort that agreed to the debate to the topic when they came to the tournament. B. It's the only stasis point we know before the round, so it controls the internal link to engagement. There's no other way to use ground if debaters aren't prepared to defend it. 2. Limits. There are over 76 Fs accounting for just the EIU index, which is compounded by non-state democracies and broad definitions. Unlimited topics incentivize obscure Fs and kill reciprocal preference, which is key to well-researched class, especially since there's no universal dissent because each country's politics are different. They deck functional limits because they allow for non-state democracies such as the EU. 1. T is dropped the debater. Their abusive advocacy skewed the debate from the start. 2. Comes before 1A or theory. A. If we had to be abusive, it's because it was impossible to engage their FB. T outweighs on scope because their abuse affected every speech that came after the 1AC. C. Topic norms outweigh on urgency. We only have a few months to set them. 3. Use competing interps. A. Topicality is a yes-no question. You can't be reasonably topical. B. Reasonability invites arbitrary judgment intervention and a race to the bottom of questionable argumentation. 4. No RBIs. A. Forcing the 1NC to go all in on the shell kills substance education and negs rat. B. It discourages checking real abuse. C. Encourages baiting outweighs because if the shell is frivolous, they can beat it quickly. Next off is the counterplan. Text. The United Nations General Assembly should request an advisory opinion with binding force stating that the European Parliament elections lack of compulsory voting violates human rights and international law and pass a concurrent resolution that non-compliance with the International Court of Justice's opinion constitutes an enforceable violation of charter obligations. The UN ICJ should convene and if a dispute is present, issue a binding advisory opinion that the EU not implementing the above ruling is a violation of the UN charter obligations. The ICJ has jurisdiction to rule on compulsory voting. Solves the whole F. Meyer Ollendorf. 12. The right to vote is well established into law within UN instruments. Law has furnished examples of restriction on the right to vote. Future general comment on Article 25. Additional detail in this issue whether compulsory voting is compatible Article 25 percent. The counterplan obviously solves multilateralism by strengthening global institutions, and it solves EU legitimacy because they're seen as being less populist if they work with global institutions. The counterplan's key to ICJ cred, which solves territorial conflicts. Perm fails. Anger 8. ICJ duty to further the principles of the UN advisory function serves as a call for participation institutional functioning as a check on political organs in light of loss of autonomy. Everybody's benefits. Court should defer less rendering decisions not with preferences, results is more independent, legitimate opinions, better enforcement. ICJ will signal the function, change more vitalized jurisdiction to aid settlement of international disputes. Goes nuclear, track robot 10, security disputes / expansion, territorial disputes, major security challenge, territorial disputes, such as a big flashpoint, we can snowball to a major conflict, turning into a nuclear conflict. The case, under review, 1 year theory is legitimate, but it shouldn't have predetermined paradigm issues. Punishment should always be reciprocal to abuse. Don't give the death penalty for shoplifting, which means they can remake these arguments in the 1AR. Drop the debater unconditionally makes every argument inherently risky, which decks fairness. The liberal international order stuff, the EU cannot salvage it. The US has been the largest player for the century, and Trump is withdrawing from every agreement. Trade war with China, protectionism, and America first are all alt causes to decline. There is no specific scenario for escalation or extinction. They just have this general sort of trend analysis, which isn't even warranted anywhere in the card. And individual countries can solve individual problems. There are evidence-less nuclear war, climate change, and tech, all of which are caused by individual states, i.e., India and Pakistan can resolve conflict. China can reduce emissions. They have zero reason why multilateral institutions are key. When I see impacts are exaggerated, the myth of the liberal international order. 17 mythology around the order can be exaggerated. Washington frequently supports made signal self-interest moves. Supposed wars not always have a non-effect. Washington cannot prevent the laws of China, partition of Germany. Korea Soviet suppression failure in Vietnam. Skip the next card. Warming. Adaptation checks extinction from warming, but CO2 prevents famine, collapse of ag, and ice age. Those are coming now. More. 16. How long would it have to bring the absence of human caused CO2 emissions until depletion of CO2 in the atmosphere levels to level that began to decrease biomass due to starvation until the beginning of end of life in the absence of human caused emissions? CO2 levels would have continued to fall to less major glaciation here could have been at any time absence of human caused CO2. Another major glaciation could have occurred for 90 million years. Global temperature rose while CO2 levels steadily declined. Answers are every species living today survived through this period. Every species alive today stands for species that survived through its conditions. At least one question is predictions of mass species extinction. They collapse if human civilization with the average global temperature exceeds the rise of 2. Major glaciation is coincided with the levels of the CO2 in the atmosphere. Increases CO2 is responsible for increased plant growth on global scales. 25% up to 50% of human CO2 emissions are absorbed by increased plant growth. Of CO2 reaches concentration well above the near starvation levels experienced during the major glaciation. Most prestigious Australian science body showed CO2 benefits plants to become more efficient in photosynthesis and growing faster without using more water. Humans are not going to use fossil fuels energy. CO2 concentration would continue to drop. That beginning of the end of life on most planet Earth would begin. We cannot grow food or crops in dependence on glaciers and furnaces until the possible starvation of life, bringing climatic conditions similar to perhaps even more severe than this incurred in previous glaciations that would lead to widespread famine and collapse of human civilization. The spacious shift from fearing CO2 as a toxic pollutant to celebrating CO2 as a giver of life from a world with higher level of CO2 in the atmosphere would result in greener world with more plant biomass, higher yields of food crops, increasing human emission, restoring a balance of the global carbon cycle by returning some of the CO2 back to the atmosphere. Their evidence is politicized rambling, no science. Fleming 19. Those who support climate change most important and more motivated by political reasons are wrong in every respect. It's been shown by every conceivable point of view that there's no correlation previous distinction between one false premise, not on hard facts. Best science proves no warming impact. It's so at all 18. The IPCC does not follow the established rule statements are not warranted by science. CO2 levels has not been stable, making us help the IPCC's assumptions. Warming has not been shown to be a natural variability, solar irradiance, magnetic fields, UV flux, and cosmic rays may have greater influence. There's little evidence that warming has caused general increase in weather. Science suggests milder weather, sea level rises, not accelerating plants have responded positively. Rising temperatures and carbon dioxide appeals to consensus surveys are variable. They ask the wrong questions. So wrong people know survey data exists. That's support claims and consensus 31,009 petitions saying there's no evidence. Climate change won't cause conflict. Boom. 16 linked with climate conflicts over climate war was being perceived as natural and during long-term historical tensions. The impact of drought was general. Really limited. After impacts are exaggerated. Rainforest resiliency. Peacock 13. Rainforest may have been vulnerable to rising carbon levels as previously thought. Predictions of how much lose it could be too high. Existing models overestimate forest dieback. The likelihood of an dieback is historically lower and inferred. Any loss is inability to store carbon is balanced by the fact that growth enhanced by higher carbon dioxide levels. Mark the card at higher carbon dioxide levels. Actually the disease stuff. There's no impact. We're all social distancing, and we already know how to prevent things like pandemics because we've lived through one. Disease outbreaks renew science diplomacy, which stables great power tension that turns the AFCARE 09. The stimulus for collaboration remains the selfish national interest efforts combat, transport, or health. Threats are cases in point. Shared scientific goals overshadow conflicts. Hard to see how many governments that offered tangible health improvement would not open doors. Science diplomacy has enormous potential for improving relations. Science diplomacy open doors between people in conflict. Keep them open when relationships are tough. The econ stuff, I guess. AI, growth-oriented AI ensures extinction. That's Puyo 18. Challenges sustainable and superintelligent or independent superintelligence could in turn be infected by socioeconomic conditions, which it develops new liberalism, a major force in shaping current policy and sharp conscious worth view superintelligence aligned with capitalist markets would have undesirable consequence for humanity and the whole biosphere. And nuclear has been creating a very special breeding ground for superintelligent liberal policy, actively transferring decision to markets. Automated governance foundational tentacles are partly shared by firms themselves. Mark the card at firms themselves, and no impact to economic decline. We've just lived through one. All of their impact evidence is written from 2018. And no impact to economic decline. Davis and Pelk 17. Under economic crisis, states access and more restraint controlling foreign parts. We also take into account manipulate currency circumstances give rise to an individual incentive for aggressive strategic self-restraint from trade partners and similar economic trouble. Under crisis, government leaders fear where council when they cannot afford trade organization provide monitoring and facilities coordination. Any to protect industries will trigger similar moves. Global crisis trade informal mechanism, legal rule, hard times bring more or less international cooperation.
Good for cross.
Yeah.
On the ICJ counterplan,
Mhm.
why does it specifically have to be European Union voting policy that reinvigorates its legitimacy?
But what it doesn't. It's just like the counterplan has an internal net benefit that if we are able to rule on compulsory voting in the EU, that would bolster EU or like ICJ legitimacy. We would be able to solve for better territorial disputes, things like that.
Okay. I guess to sort of ask my question correctly, then I'm sort of wondering if your argument about how the sort of jurisdiction to rule on compulsory voting, I'm wondering if that's like specifically contextualized to the EU. Like, I'm asking, does that ruling have to be on the European Union parliamentary in order for that reinvigoration to occur, or would that sort of reinvigoration occur as a product of ruling on compulsory voting in any sort of democratic institution?
I think we can make arguments about why EU specifically would be good, given all of the evidence about how like populism is on the rise in the EU specifically right now. But no, our evidence is about like compulsory voting rulings are good.
Okay, that seems fine. Just on the LIO case debate, what prose did you read?
I read just everything except for the Niblet card, I think.
Great. Status of the counterplan?
Condo.
And I guess how can, like, you say individual countries can solve all sort of like multilateral problems.
Well, they're not multilateral problems, is the argument.
How is warming not a multilateral problem?
Because like countries can reduce emissions. That doesn't require multilateral action at all.
Wait,
like China's doing much better at reducing emissions, and they're not participating in like multilateral.
So like countries are just gonna like magically decide to like reduce their emissions.
Well, it's not magic; it's happening. Like China is doing much better at emissions control than countries like the U.S.
Have you seen the last 4 years of U.S. climate policy? Like, I get that you have pointed out to one major superpower that is like doing some work regarding like emissions.
Wait, what's your point about the U.S.?
Well, no, my point is that the U.S. is an example of sort of a much larger concept that China is an exception to. Insofar as countries,
the U.S. is a perfect example of how multilateral institutions fail because all of these people are just pulling out or they're not abiding by the institutions.
Which is probably why we need to re-legitimize them. I guess so. For the ICJ counterplan, or actually, does boosting the ICJ sort of strengthen any global multilateral institutions other than the ICJ proper?
Strengthen any global multilateral institution.
Like, do you have any arguments about how like the UN, the EU, etc., would become sort of more legitimized by this ruling?
I mean, I made those arguments analytically, so I guess so.
Well, could you explain the ones for me?
Well, this counterplan is an example of strengthening global institutions. Global institutions are multilateral.
Sure. Taking breath. Oh, 120 taken, sending the dog. It is set. Now I got the email from the NC.
I'm ready.
Danielle, you good?
Sorry, what's the order?
Order is going to be Topicality, the case page, case starting on like the link debate, the LAO stuff, then DDEV, then the ICJCP.
I'm good.
Great. Counter-interpretation of Republican specified democracy, Air Force One in the group USF. A person before singular number of women to hospital is used to introduce a specific member of the group and refer to one member of the class or group. A singular denotes an instance where women are used to the function before singular and denote a particular instance. In air after default, the pragmatics is incredibly ambiguous, so odds are they're just wrong about semantics. National Law Review 11. Federal Circuit noted claims are supported entirely in the claim of construction and non-harm pass when rules that A always mean more than one, and one is appropriate to constitution. Open-ended claim, and for additionally, one is class forces in every research released into one's debates about politics and voting systems of various democracies, and two Afghan and no TPA, no attention applies to all pigs in each country's different political and electoral system, which means pigs with the TPA so worse than aspect because next have generics like NCs and KSF, none versus pigs and 3 to 1 defense, only 13 inherent full democracies in the overlimit to 1F, which is right by how specific next 4 functional limits, small intention lose the KCs, NC, misinformed voters, democracies, says are conscientious objectors, and prioritize pragmatics over semantics. One, pragmatics check acts like abolish electoral college lose the limits because they're qualitatively different, and two clumps in pragmatics. We read topic literature research, not grammar dictionaries, which choosing only impact to semantics is limits, which sort of turn their predictability argument 3 self under the ceiling or definition means there's a chance where the topic results are often in 4 jurisdiction is nonsense and the T rule doesn't exist because judges vote on T-apps all the time. Reasonability specifically on topicality for benefit have been focused on semantics even if we're marginally outside of the topic in terms of semantic position. You should use a bright line to ground predictability. The case page. The plan revitalizes EU legitimacy in the face of high policies which is key to the international liberal order that is accomplished by increasing sort of the progressive quality of turnout and by conceptualizing, legitimizing the EU by EU Parliament by passing a policy that has influence on all member states in the international community. That's also extinction from A, warming, which is sort of linear and leads to desertification, which is agricultural production, and is key to sort of key to preventing disease. Though line knowledge proper, they say LAO can't be salvaged because there are old causes, but no, first of all, the old causes are a product of Trumpism, and also Biden's going to win in 2020, which means that doesn't matter. And the reason LAO is failing because there's no cohesive body, but insofar as the EU is legitimate, is sort of like perceived legitimately and perceptively in the eyes of the rest of the international community, capable of passing stable policies and services a bargaining chip and a table for negotiation that would boost the LAO. They say individual states solve it. No cooperation for things like warming is key because countries engage in the game of real politics. But they think if they boost their emission standards, that's not going to foster change in others, and they'll be losing economic advantage, which means multilateral cooperation is key. They send a scenario, but no, this is a probabilistic question. We make a linear argument about the future and say that it is probable that there will be a scenario, even if we can't specify what it is. If we have certain sort of geopolitical conditions in the world, the CO2 ag argument. This argument is diminishing marginal utility, incomplete studies, nitrogen fixing desire for skepticism, trade-offs, and health deficits, and more this needed team. If you're steadily in the lab for the sense of willing to ultra not what happens outside and it's the primary nitrogen is often the primary controller and drowning heat stress would overwhelm any direct benefits. The more CO2 you have, the less benefit you get. And when you go to 1 to 2 degrees of warming, you see negative effects. So one more should deficit for heat directly replacing interference with reproductive process. CO2 also benefits. Weeds that compete with farms and food becomes less nutritious. Crops lose. I think it also because of protein deficit and nutritional deficiencies are always public health threats. We'll concede that warming doesn't cause extinction independently, but the fact that it melts ice caps and releases pathogens is our scenario. Their disease defense doesn't apply. People are sort of commuting now because they're recovering from COVID, and our evidence is specifically in the context of last resort of ancient 4 million year old bacteria, which was sort of resolves last resort drugs, which means they can't overcome that. Their DDEV scenario doesn't have a link. This is specifically to collapse. We've just made an argument how perpetuated decline causes war, and they haven't answered the warrants that sort of a long period of time frame decline would cause war, even if it hasn't. Yes, because there isn't sufficient time frame. ICJ. International field as a voting show is self-likely for overturn potential actions which acts after having exposed negative ground plus let's them see out of any advantage to the AFN one prove the AFN at the ICG rule and the legitimacy of the maintenance of your United Kingdom voting rights in the EU parliamentary solves the contextualization of their offense and two to vote. No, actually skip that. No enforcement. ECJ rejects it. Powers 12. Judicial bodies have issues of EU laws raised by including the ICJ and these tribunals cannot make the ECJ reference the commission cannot bring proceedings if they are international tribunals by the ECJ's reasoning are unlawful. The ECJ's insistence that it must be a final arbiter is rigid and no impact. It can't resolve the case. The ICJ can just rule on legal institutions. They can't solve as a modern multilateral bargaining chip, and intrinsic limited intrinsicness is justified to check artificial competition.
Okay. Prep. The only independent reason to reject the team was
International
IFIAT.
Yeah.
Cool. Did you read the Zimmer 18 evidence? AT adaptation.
No, I did
Bottom.
not.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Counterpoint case.
Sounds good.
All right. Everyone ready?
On
Let me just find my. All right. Cool.
There's no doc, right?
There's no doc.
Yeah, I'm good.
Kick the counterplan not going for it gets rid of all of abuse because it means that it's not the deciding factor in the debate. Perms are simply a test of competition. Counterinterpretation, the net gets one international actor counterplan. One, education, discussing international actors teaches about real world interactions between governments, which is key to real world education because not just the EU is an actor in the real life. There's a bunch of multilateral institutions, which is emphasized by the fact that all of their impact evidence is about how important learning about these sort of institutions are. Second, it increases Afghan. US good arguments or EU good arguments can become offense. They can reach specific offense against our actor like the ICJ, which is proven by the fact that they read things like ECJ checks in this round. Three, it's resolutionally based. International actors are the only way to actually gain any sort of leverage on the negative against against all of these diverse arrays of different affirmatives, which means that their interpretation of the resolution would make negating literally impossible because there's no generic dissent. Every country is so different. 4, there's no risk of offense they don't link to. It's no more far-fetched to pretend that the entire EU does something, the entire ICJ does something. 5, literature checks. There's no literature that 90% of the countries in the EU are suddenly going to, that all the countries in the EU are suddenly going to adopt compulsory voting. That all the countries in the world are suddenly going to adopt compulsory voting. We aren't the utopian form of international fiat, which means that you should err on the side of reasonability. You should err on the side of reasonability because we're simply saying that a single international institution should act, not that sort of utopian everyone suddenly stops having war. It's not infinitely regressive or sort of illogical because we're only fiating one governmental actor, and real world politicians obviously can decide whether to do things like international action. Airnag, the AF already gets infinite prep first and last speeches, resolutional interpretation. Our counterplan gives them presumption, and you should drop the argument, not the team. They didn't make a unique drop the argument, drop the debate, or they didn't make a unique drop the debate or warrant drop the argument. Ensures that we can get back to substance and maximize education and fairness. I guess case. I'll concede CO2 agriculture, but I'm going for the Ice Age impactor, and it was literally in the more evidence. It's in the tag. It's not a hidden trick whatsoever. You just straight up dropped it. You only read a card to respond to CO2 ag, except you didn't respond whatsoever to the fact that glaciations are coming now, and they will kill everyone. They will collapse agriculture, which turns your CO2 ag argument because it makes it impossible to grow any food if glaciers are covering the entirety of the world and we can't grow any crops on ice. Warming is key to reverse that sort of trend, which also turns all of your disease impacts, because the only way to actually solve back for those sorts of diseases, it turns the disease impact because it proves that glaciation is good, not bad. Independently, it outweighs all of your disease and CO2 ag impacts on probability and magnitude. It outweighs on probability because your disease impact relies on like some pocket of disease being hidden in a permafrost. That has to be, we know for sure that there is a glaciation coming because that internal link was straight conceded, which means there's a 100% chance that everyone will die if you vote affirmative. Second is it outweighs on magnitude. It covers the entirety of the world. Disease, I'll put in some impact I'll put some impact defense on disease, but regardless of whether you think disease is an actual threat or not, disease only might kill everyone, but you know that if the whole world froze over, we would all die because that is literally how biology works. Second, they've conceded the science, diplomacy, impact defense, and impact turn on the disease impact. It was just straight dropped in the one era. There was no response to it. Science, diplomacy solves back for every single global war, which checks back for every single threat. It outweighs on magnitude because nuclear war would kill literally everyone. It would cause climate change, and it would turn all of their disease impacts because it would decimate healthcare and hospital systems. Science diplomacy would disease would cause science diplomacy. That was the conceded CARE 09 evidence. It would stabilize great power tensions because it would stimulate collaboration between different countries, which is proven by things like COVID, where different countries are working together to find a solution in the EU. Next, I guess I'll extend another piece of impact defense, which is that COVID-19 isn't taken into account by their disease impact. Their evidence is way too old. We've already all learned how to social distance. We know to wear masks. We know that we need to do things like we know what to do in the face of a global pandemic, which means that their disease evidence doesn't take into account the fact that everyone knows how to deal with diseases, which means that the risk of disease literally killing everyone is very small, and you should err on the side of extinction because it kills all future value. Lastly, I'll go for the DDEV impact term. This is just game over. They straight conceded that their only response was that it doesn't apply, but literally read the DDEV evidence. Nowhere in this evidence does it mention a collapse. It is about growth-oriented AI, which means that if the app perpetuates growth by installing EU legitimacy and ensuring that sort of economic model of growth continues, they will inevitably result in some sort of creation of growth-oriented AI because people want to maximize profit, so they'll create artificial intelligence in order to maximize that sort of profit. But they've conceded the Pueyo 18 evidence, which is that growth-oriented AI ensures extinction because that sort of neoliberal model of growth is fundamentally unsustainable. It causes AI to want to eliminate humans because of sort of backwards logic and bad programming in AI systems. Even if you think this is unlikely, they straight up conceded the scenario, and they conceded that it causes extinction because it's the sort of growth. They said it conceded it causes extinction if we continue to pursue that sort of long-term growth trend, which means that the only way you can prevent extinction is by affirming degrowth orientation, by not voting affirmative and allowing for that sort of long-term trend of degrowth and economic recession. I guess extend that. I mean, they conceded the econ impact, but I'll extend some more impact defense. Crashes empirically don't cause war, and long-term decline doesn't cause war. We've been in like the longest global recession since the Great Depression because of COVID-19, and we all haven't died. They conceded the Davis and Pelk evidence, which says there's no impact. Now I'll put some, I guess, impact defense on the liberal order stuff. Their only internal link to warming disease impacts is the liberal order, but I'm going for all of the alt causes. Their response was that this is because of Trumpism. Yes, exactly. It's because of Trumpism. The F does nothing to Trumpism because it only affects the EU, which means that since the US has been the largest player in the liberal international order for a decade, simply the EU doing something won't change the fact that the US, which is the key player, is still withdrawing from every single agreement. They've conceded our examples: trade war with China, protectionism, and America first are all causes that prove the liberal order is declining. China will be able to fill in. Autocratic scenarios will happen. There is no specific scenario for escalation or extinction. Even if you think it's true that they allow for some general trend, the fact that they have no specific scenario, and I've isolated a bunch of empirical studies that prove all of my impacts are going to happen, should make you err very, very heavily on the side of probability. And they have no, actually, yeah, you shouldn't allow you to err impact calc. They had the chance to do that in the 1AR. I don't have a 3NR to respond. So impact calc, new responses, all of that, you shouldn't allow.
$240. Order is going to be case, I guess. Is everybody good?
Yep.
The plan revitalizes the legitimacy in the face of hypothesis, which is key to the international liberal order preservation, as well as extinction from preventing warming in the immediate time frame, which stops melting permafrost, which releases antibiotic-resistant sort of diseases that cause extinction. I'll do the internal link line right now. They say all causes mean liberal order collapses, but no, the all causes they explain was Trumpism, which they conceded is going to end with the Biden re-election, and independently these all causes are product of no cohesive international organization like legitimized EU binding sort of countries together, which the AF provides. It doesn't matter if we don't have scenario because we're going for the war warming, therefore the disease impact, which is sort of more linear and talks about gradual cooperation between, which talks about sort of gradual cooperation between states, and for the entirety of the impact of it, yes, give me due sort of impact. How can weighing a bunch of the explanation of the tumor was brand new, and I can't identify how they're going to sort of interpret it and weigh between different impact arguments they made coming out of the NC, especially when they make multiple, which means if I can't do sort of impact calc and weighing or make new arguments in the tutorial, then what am I supposed to do? The line proper. They can't go for the DDF argument. My 1 year was super short on it because this response is true. They are right that any sort of growth is sufficient to trigger their AI impact, but they are wrong in the fact that their uniqueness evidence specifically specifies that a global crash and collapse is necessary to prevent that sort of AI development. It might be the case that sort of regrowing the European economy might lead to AI development insofar as growth is going to be inevitable absent a crash. That impact is terminally non-unique. We just sort of talked about perpetual decline being an impact of not voting AF, which isn't sufficient to stop the sort of AI growth, which means their impact evidence is terminally non-unique, which means all I have to win is sort of the warming disease impact and take out the ice age argument, and then it's an easy AF ballot. The warming stuff. We'll concede warming doesn't cause extinction, and we will concede that sort of glaciarization is going to occur in the long term. However, the disease. You're right. I did not explicitly answer the glaciation argument in the 1AR, but you should hold them to the claims that their evidence makes, and I can do new time frame weighing insofar as they've made claims about how sort of ice age cycles are natural processes within sort of Earth's geological conditions. That means given a sufficiently large time frame, glaciation would start to occur again, which means warming would offset it. But that does not change the fact that sort of glaciation is not happening in the status quo, which means increased warming now will sort of melt the permafrost, and is sufficient to release 4 million-year-old bacteria. You should prioritize time frame because you don't know what sort of technologies we're going to invent to decrease the probability or impacts of glaciarization in the future. Insofar as we can access our disease impact that comparatively turns and outweighs any sort of impact turn or offense coming out of the 2NR. Insofar as all of their defense about COVID assumes that these are the sorts of diseases that human technology has been resistant to, and the fact that they conceded that these are 4 million-year-old diseases developed from Neanderthals that are resistant to last resort bacteria. Independently, they conceded that COVID sort of declining now, which means that people are recovering and stopping to use social distance, which means you get absolutely wrecked by this disease. That was a Millet evidence. Vote on extinction. It outweighs on time frame. Good debate.